Chances are good that if you have an anime-based game of some kind, especially one where there's heavy emphasis on various relationships between a large roster of characters, it's a good bet that you've drifted into visual novel territory. Once in a blue moon, though, you'll find that these visual novel segments have made their way into other genres, and the shmup is definitely no exception.
Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa, or Silver Wings, is a shooting game that does more or less just that, featuring a whole new story arc that follows the 501st Joint Fighter Wing as they take on a new Nuroi menace. Released in 2010 to the Xbox 360 by Cyberfront and Gulty, with a portable version seeing released to the PSP in 2012, could a game based on an anime license whose primary existence is based on fanservice really be good though? Let's take a closer look.
To start, players only have access to Strike Witch's story mode, in which players take control of a detachment of 3 predetermined witches. Each of these trios have their own subplots to the main plot as a whole, so playing through all story arcs leads to new dialogue, even if the game's progression is more or less the same every time.
Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa is, at its core, a twin-stick shooting game disguised as a side-scroller. Players move a trio of witches about the screen with the left analog stick, while independently firing with the right stick at any angle they choose. It's a pretty simple system that actually works pretty well.
The Xbox 360 shoulder buttons and triggers also have additional functions. Pressing the left bumper or trigger will cycle forward or backward through the witches in your group, allowing for their fire type to be used to taste. The right bumper changes the overall formation from an all-forward-facing grouping to a forward and rear-facing formation to trailing and back again. These formations allow for enemies to be attacked more easily when approaching from all sides at once, though using these formations isn't a necessity.
Finally, pressing and holding the right trigger will engage your group's super attack. This will last as long as the gauges under their portraits in the top left-hand corner of the screen allow. This technique is also accompanied by a barrier and can sometimes cause a boost or cut in speed as well. If the whole gauge isn't depleted, there is a short cooldown period before these gauges recharge at a steady rate. The lead witch can use her super attack without cooldown as long as there is at least some power to it, and both other witches' gauges are at full, but the biggest powerhouse attacks are only usable when all 3 are full to max.
The core gameplay to Strike Witches is very bullet hell style, with enemies appearing from all angles on the screen. While each witch is fairly sizable on the screen, the lead witch's tiny red hitbox makes it pretty easy to avoid the barrage-style enemy fire. The trio at large has a segmented life gauge in lieu of lives that gets replenished between stages as well. If hit, a brief barrier appears to nullify surrounding bullets. In addition, this barrier can also deflect laser attacks as long as they are fairly offset from the center of the circle.
Every stage has a pretty extensive boss, some of which can take quite a while to destroy. These bosses all have a central core that, once destroyed, will cause the whole boss to explode. Many smaller parts need to be taken out before the core is exposed though, making for a fairly dynamic and engaging battle.
As the story mode is cleared with more and more teams, they become available in the Unlockable arcade mode, which nixes the story scenes and allows players to get through the game proper with little mess or fuss. In addition, as the game is cleared with more teams in story mode, the witches used are unlocked and become available to form a custom team of 3 to take on the arcade mode with.
There are also additional story scenes, art pieces, and a sound test that can be triggered by exploring the Strike Witches base after completing the story with different teams. The only catch to the story elements in Strike Witches? All of it is in Japanese, meaning that some players' mileage will definitely vary. In addition, the extra bits of content that was made available on Xbox Live for download have since been delisted when Cyberfront went under. This missing content did make it into the 2012 PSP version of the game, though.
All in all, the gameplay is solid and it works pretty well in the whole, but it may be just a bit too simple. It's pretty easy to see that the main focus of Hakugin no Tsubasa is the storytelling aspect between the full cast of characters. So with such a straightforward nature, how does Strike Witch's scoring factor in? As far as scoring goes, Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa's score mechanics are even simpler than its gameplay. In addition to your typical destruction score, medals fall from every enemy destroyed and can be collected for a bonus between 1,000 and 100,000 points apiece.
There isn't much to this process either. Collecting 100 medals increases the score per pickup from 1,000 to 10,000. At 200 medals, each one increases to 100,000 points. Nothing to it. The value never drops, save for making it to the next stage or having the player die and continue.
Aside from medal and destruction score, a stage end bonus is also applied, taking the number of medals collected and enemies destroyed into consideration. Medal count multiplied by enemies killed multiplied by 10,000 makes up the bonus, which will decrease depending on how many times a player is hit.
Online and local leaderboards exist for Strike Witches, so players can still see how they rank against players from around the world. This aspect of the game does present some replay value, even if the game itself is pretty rough around the edges.
For fans of the light novels, manga, and anime, Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa is probably going to resonate with them more than your typical shooting game fan. With its huge amount of exposition and fully voiced content delivered by each character's actual voice actress from the anime, Strike Witches could really be glossed over as a visual novel at a glance.
逃げたんか。どうするみんな。このまま追っかけようか。
That said, the delivery of each character's VO is as you'd expect from a bunch of professional actresses. Of course, once again, everything is in Japanese, so unless players have a solid grasp of the language, a lot of the exposition could be lost on this game's Western players.
Granted, the anime and manga in specific is super fanservice heavy by nature, and the story was never really what anyone would consider deep, so arcade mode might just be enough for some. At least the visual and character design is good, pantsu notwithstanding.
The environments and in-game models are only really average though, with a lot of muddy textures that aren't as clear as we would have liked. Most models are fairly low poly as well, but at least it all runs at a solid 60 frames per second. Still, much more should have been done with the Xbox 360's hardware.
Strike Witch's sound is also pretty solid, though not fantastic. Character VO is definitely the standout feature in terms of sound design for pretty obvious reasons. The music both around the base and in-game is serviceable, but there isn't much that is especially memorable about the compositions. Meanwhile, the sound effects are mostly good for what they represent, though the shot sounds are pretty weak on the whole.
The addition of story scenes as you explore the Strike Witch's base is also a nice touch, though it's more or less your typical extra story visual novel fare, and again, it's all in Japanese. So your mileage might vary if you're not up to code with the language. As always, Xbox achievements round out the presentation.
Basically, Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa is a decently fun shooting game that doesn't demand much of its players while featuring a whole bunch of content for fans of the series, albeit content that is pretty language dependent. But how does it all stack up? Let's take a look. Movement is pretty straightforward with a loss of accuracy through the analog stick in tight spaces. Players should expect to get hit often.
Using a D-pad works, but it also feels very unnatural, especially switching between the two.
As far as challenge goes, Strike Witches isn't especially difficult overall.
That said, the controls will add an unintentional layer of difficulty thanks to its imprecise nature.
For length, the multiple teams encourages replay, but it's essentially the same thing no matter the group outside of the Japanese-only story.
Simple scoring and online leaderboards also enhances replay.
Visually, on the one hand, Strike Witch's character design is, of course, very strong, as any game based on an anime should be.
While the mechanical design is pretty neat, the in-game models and effects still leave a lot to be desired.
Strike Witch's sound is also mixed. The voice tracks are once again top-notch, which comes as no surprise.
Otherwise, the sound effects are weedy and the music is mostly forgettable with very few standout tracks.
There isn't much to say about Strike Witch's ingenuity. It's neat to have 3 characters in formation, but the gameplay is pretty simple and not much can be said of its weak scoring system.
Strike Witches has its place for fans of the series, but hardcore players will definitely want a lot more out of it.
As an anime-licensed game, Strike Witch's Hakugin no Tsubasa shouldn't surprise anyone with its lack of technical finesse. As with so many licensed games, it falls flat in a very typical way. This one is really only for hardcore Strike Witches fans or Xbox 360 shooting collection completionists only. Strike Witches Hakugin no Tsubasa gets a 3 out of 5. You can get a copy of Strike Witches Hakugin no Tsubasa at auction for roughly $26. Big-time collectors can also get a premium collector's edition with a Yoshika Nendoroid figure for anywhere between $65 and $110. However, this game is also region locked, meaning that you'll need a Japanese Xbox 360 to play it.